Seja bem-vindo, Tim Medin. Tim Medin vai trazer um grande conhecimento sobre cibersegurança. Aliás, especialista em trazer conhecimento para todos. Tim, é com você.
Hi, thank you for the invitation to come to the Cyber Security Summit. I'm honored to be here. Thank you all for attending. I can't wait till we eventually, get some more of these back in person, but these virtual things are kind of nice from the comfort of our own home. Anyways, real quick here, brief introduction. My name is Tim Medin. I'm going to be talking to you about Kerberoasting. Kerberoasting is one such piece. We'll talk about some of the Kerberos attacks. My quick background: I work for a company called Red Siege. I am a SANS instructor, a senior SANS instructor. I am also the lead author of the pen test course at SANS. Also, IANS faculty. So with that, let's get rolling. We've got a lot of content to cover here in our just our short time together, right? I could talk about this for hours. In fact, I have in the past. But what is Kerberos, right? What the heck is this thing? Well, in the mythology, Kerberos is the three-headed dog that guards the entrance to the underworld. Right, keeps the damned in hell, if you will. In the Windows world, it is used for authentication. It keeps the damned in hell. No, I'm just kidding. But this mythical creature has three heads. The three heads here are going to be important because there are three very important pieces when it comes to Kerberos. Now, the three pieces here that are important with Kerberos are the KDC, the Key Distribution Center. This is a logical role that runs in a domain controller, or DC. So during this presentation, you might hear me use these terms interchangeably. You might hear me say KDC, DC. For all intents and purposes, it's the same system in the Windows domain. The other one is the client. We've got the user or the system that's attempting to authenticate to another service. And then, of course, as I just sort of hinted to, we have the third thing, which is the target service. Now, with Kerberos, for all intents and purposes, each of the outer heads trust the center head to some degree. And we'll look through more of what this authentication process looks like, but it allows me to present myself to the KDC, prove who I am to some degree, and then use that proof to authenticate to the remote system. And the remote system will then decide what level of access that I have. Now, with Kerberos, there is a single secret. It's the password hash for the account here. So in my case, it's going to be the password hash for my account. If I'm attempting to access a system, it's going to be my password hash. We're also going to have one for the target service. So we'll have that password hash for the target service account. There's also going to be one related to the KDC. We'll come back and we'll spend some more time discussing that in a little bit and some really fun attacks related to this. So how does Kerberos authentication work? I tried to break this down as simply as I can. Here's the first step. So I've got my computer here on the left, and I want to authenticate to the KDC. I want to prove I am Tim. So what do? Well, I take my password hash and I use it to encrypt a timestamp. Now, we encrypt the timestamp to prevent any sort of replay types attacks. Now, I know my password, at least I know my password hash. The KDC knows my password hash, not my password, just the password hash, right? The domain controller knows that, so I can authenticate. So I will encrypt the timestamp using my password hash, send it then to the KDC. KDC grabs my password hash, attempts to decrypt, and says, this looks good, or this does not look good, right? Realistically, I'm going to get my password right pretty much all the time, right? So it is going to decrypt using my password hash. What happens then is once I've authenticated, I get back, let me go back actually, is I get in response what's called a ticket granting ticket. So this doesn't let me directly ride any of the rides, if you will, inside the domain. Think of this. I don't know if how many of you have been to Disney, I think World's the one in Florida, right? They've got those magic bands, right? You get your magic band, but you don't, when you first get it, you use that to get on any of the rides, right? That lets you into the park. That's sort of the ticket granting ticket. It allows us into the park. And then after that, we can go on rides. So this is a general ticket granting ticket. What happens now, if I want to, let's say, go on a ride, I need to request a specific ticket. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present my ticket granting ticket to the KDC and say, look, remember, you let me in here, and I want a ticket for a particular service. The KDC is going to check that ticket, look at it, looks good, and then send me a ticket for that specific service. Now, this ticket, there's two halves to it. There's a half I keep, and there's a half that I send to the target service. And it's going to have some different information each. We'll come to that, the differences here, and what's inside each of those in just a little bit. So I keep my piece. I take the piece that I'm supposed to pass to the target service, and then I send that over. Now, what happens is the target system here, the target service, decrypts the ticket using its password hash, the password hash of the target service. It will then check the signature and say, hey, this signature looks good. Now, an important thing to note here is the domain controller doesn't decide if I have access to the service. The domain controller inside that ticket says, this is who Tim is. This is Tim's username. This is the groups Tim is a member of. And then the target service decides if I have any access at all. And if I do, what level of access do I have? We get to kind of think of that like a driver's license. Okay, there's this piece inside the ticket called the pack. That proves there's a hologram, if you will, right? You get a driver's license. There's a little hologram here to prove that it's legitimate. Well, that's the signature on the pack, right? And if I go to, a restaurant that requires ID before I order any sort of adult beverages, into a club, whatever it might be, they look at my driver's license and then they make the decision. They don't call up the state of Texas and say, hey, can we allow Tim in here? Right? Imagine how overwhelmed the state of Texas would be if every time somebody came into a venue when they needed to check ID, that they had to call the state and ask the state that the person was allowed in. Right? That's kind of how Kerberos works. Where Kerberos is the state to some degree and says, here's your ID. And then the places that I go, look at that ID, say, look, based on what I know, this ID looks legitimate. And based on this, we're going to allow Tim and the level of access that we're going to allow. So let's do a quick recap here. I know we went through some technical pieces here. Let's do a quick recap on what this authentication looks like. There's sort of three pieces, much like the three heads of Kerberos. The first piece, I'm going to prove I'm allowed in. Right? I'm going to prove that I'm allowed into Disney World. I'm going to get my magic band, my ticket granting ticket. I encrypt the timestamp using my password hash. The domain controller also knows my password hash. It can decrypt, and I've proved that I am Tim. At that point, I get my ticket granting ticket. Now, that's the first piece. Now, at some point later, or frankly, multiple points later, I'm going to want access to some service of some kind. I'm going to present that ticket granting ticket. I'm not going to go through the whole process of getting a new one. That is my master key, if you will, that says this is Tim, and I'm going to prove this over and over again. Hey, there's a web server. Cool. I like to authenticate to that. Here is my ticket granting ticket, and I get a service ticket for that particular system, and I pass that service ticket to the service. The service then decides. Now, maybe there's a web server, different web server. And I say, hey, I want to authenticate to that. I present my ticket granting ticket. The KDC validates it to some degree, takes the pack, puts it inside the ticket. I now send a service ticket, a unique service ticket, to the web server. Right? So I'm going to use my ticket granting ticket over and over again. My service ticket, I'm going to have to request each time I want to access a unique service. Let's take a quick peek inside that service ticket. Remember, there's two halves. There's a half I keep, and there's a half that I present to the target service, right? I keep my half. Well, what's in my half? My piece includes a validity time, includes a session key, right? I can read my half of the ticket. The other half, the arrow got messed up here. Apologies. The other half, I can't read. It's encrypted using the password hash of the target service. Now, I don't have that. We'll come back to that in a little while, but I don't have that. So I can't read this. So it's a blob that I just send to the target service. Now the target service knows its password hash. So it can decrypt, and it's going to get information about me, right? My driver's license, if you will. This is Tim. This is the information about Tim. It's also going to have a matching session key. I was given a session key by the KDC inside the server portion of the ticket. There's going to be a matching session key. So it allows us to already have encryption keys established that we can use for future communication between the user, me, and the target service. Now, the user details, what does that look like? Well, remember, we talked about the PAC, right? The PAC is the Privilege Attribute Certificate. That's my driver's license. Here is the information about Tim. You can see it here on the right. On the right, we have the account name, TM. The user RID, the group RID, and I can have an array, a list of groups that I'm also a member of. The server is then going to decide whether I have access and to what degree I have access based on that information, based on my username, my ID, my group memberships. Now remember, on a driver's license, we have that hologram, right? And any decent bouncer is going to look at the driver's license when we hand it over and say, hey, look, I do see the hologram. This thing is legitimate. Well, with a PAC, what we've got is a signature. We've got a checksum at the end. Now, the checksum here is signed using the password hash of the target service. So the ticket is encrypted, or this half of the ticket is encrypted using the password hash of the target service. It's also signed using the password hash of the target service, right? Because the target service knows its password hash, it can decrypt and verify. There's a second checksum, though. There's a second checksum. This is going to use the password hash, essentially, of the KDC. It's going to be the password hash of a very sensitive account called KRB-TGT. Now, many times, the target service is not going to validate this second signature. It's not going to ask for a second check, because what happens if that were to occur, the server would then have to send the ticket over to the KDC, the main controller. It would then have to verify and then let the server know, yes, this thing is good, or no, it's not. And that takes extra time. And if I'm authenticating to a SQL server, all I care about is speed, right? Technically, if the service is configured to run as part of the operating system, it's not going to perform this second check. So by default, SQL Server is not going to do that. Anytime you connect to a SMB share, a Windows share, it's not going to check. Counterpoint, if you connect to a web server, it will always ask for second verification. This is going to be important with one of the attacks that we talk about in a little bit. But many times there is no second check. It simply uses the target service account and the associated password hash to verify the signature and doesn't check for the second signature. So now when I connect to a service, I'm telling the KDC, the domain controller, here's the service that I'm connecting to. And there's a name here. We call this the SPN, the service principal name. This is a mapping between the name of the service and the underlying service account. Okay, let's take a look at what that actually looks like. So here's an example. We've got a mail server. The service, the name is mail / and then the fully qualified domain name of the service. In our case, Cliff, right? Any Cheers fans out there, right? We got Cliff the mailman here. our service mail/cliff.medin.local and the underlying account, in this case, mail service. Right? So I'm going to request a ticket. Hey, I know it's a mail server. I know the target system. I don't know the underlying account, but guess what? The domain controller does know that. We can actually request that. We'll come back to that in a little bit. Similarly, if I want to go to Charlotte, the web server, right? http:/charlotte.medin.local, the underlying service account. Because remember, the domain controller needs to figure out what the underlying service account password hash is so we can use that to encrypt the ticket. So that when I send the ticket to the target service, it's using the correct hash so the service can properly decrypt. Right? So I send my ticket in, request for a specific service. I then give it the ticket back. And assuming you didn't mess up your SPNs and create them incorrectly, we should get a ticket that is encrypted using the proper password hash. Now, we've talked about these password hashes a couple times. Let's be a little bit more explicit on what we're talking about here. First up, we have the password hash for me, right? The user, the client. Straightforward. Right? I've talked over and over again about the member server and its password hash. That's the second long-term key. The third key is the password hash for the KRB TGT account. That is the second signature on the pack. It's also what's used to encrypt the ticket granting ticket. Because I don't have that, only the domain controller has that. And if we can compromise that, lots of fun things can happen. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, one of my favorite attacks, well, frankly, because I came up with it, Kerberoasting. Remember, the target service, right? It's going to decrypt the service ticket using its password hash. What I can do here is I can request service tickets for any number of systems on the network. Remember, I'm making the request to the domain controller, to the KDC. I can always access that. At no point to this point am I actually communicating with the ultimate target system. I'm not. So I'm going to say, hey, domain controller, I want all of the tickets. And remember, the domain controller doesn't decide if I have access or not. The target system does based on information about me. So I can request tickets to systems that I don't have access to. They could be firewalled off. Frankly, they could be powered off or crashed. I could still request tickets. They could be taken out and recycled as long as that SPN mapping still exists, right? So I'm going to request all of these tickets. What I'm going to do then, and remember, the ticket is encrypted using the password hash of the target service. What I'm going to do then is attempt to decrypt. So I will take a password guess, hash it, and attempt to decrypt. If it's successful, I have determined the password hash for the target service. The neat thing here is this is an offline attack against service account passwords. It's an offline attack, right? I can take that ticket, send it off network to my cracking rig, and I can attack this over and over again. All I need is those tickets. There's a number of various tools that allow us to extract the tickets from memory, or will give it to us in a text file. My personal preference here is in packet. If you're going to be doing the cracking, my personal preference here is going to be use something like Hashcat for the actual cracking. It can be a little bit loud to some degree. So there are features. This is an example here as part of the Rubius framework where we can attempt to be a little bit stealthier so we don't get caught. We don't have time here to dig into this, but cool link at the bottom. You can check that out later. Now, if I have the password hash of the target service, what I can do is I can then generate my own ticket. Remember, that service ticket is encrypted and signed using the target service's password hash. Well, if I have that, maybe through Kerberoasting, maybe through some other attack, what I can do now is I can generate my own service ticket. So I'll generate my very own service ticket giving it more information about me, right? Say, you know what? Tim isn't just a regular user. Tim is actually a privileged account. Here's a couple of quick screenshots of an attack. We've got a very simple user here. So the TM account here, regular user, domain user, not an administrator on my local system. So this user TM, just a regular lowly user, right? Not a member of anything privileged on the domain, frankly, only a member of domain users. And if we, on this particular computer, look at the administrator group, Tim is not a member of either of these groups, but this attack is still going to work. Here's an example. We're using invoke Kerberos. We're going to request that ticket. Remember, any user can request any ticket for any service on the network. Right? The domain controller doesn't decide if you get the ticket or not. We copy that back, then we can crack. As I mentioned, we can use something like a hashcat to crack the service. Now, I wrote a cracker. It's in Python. It's very slow. Don't use that. You use hashcat. John the Ripper also supports, but I highly recommend using hashcat instead. So what we can do then is crack that ticket. Remember, the ticket that we've just requested is encrypted using the password hash of the target service. What I can do then is start using that account. Now, in our case, we have our target service is going to be the SQL service on our SQL 01 server. The underlying account mapped in the SPN, in this case, is SQL engine. Now, many times, database service accounts are set up as domain administrators. Very powerful. At that point, as an attacker, I can log into pretty much any system in the environment. In our scenario, let's say they set this account up correctly, where it's not an over-privileged account. And we can see here, we've got our user SQL engine, just a regular user. And if Tim attempts to log into the database server as Tim using my password, we can see here, we get bounced, right? It doesn't let us in. What we can do is we can use a tool. Mimikatz is one such example. And I'm going to generate a silver ticket. It uses the golden feature inside Mimikatz, but it's actually generating a silver ticket. We'll talk about the golden ticket here in a little bit. So what I do is I change the group memberships. So we can see under groups, we've got 512, 520, 518, 519. It's like domain administrators, schema admins, enterprise admins. When I create this ticket now, the pack, the driver's license says, Tim's a big dog, right? And I connect to the target service. It's going to say, okay, cool. We're going to allow you in. Other fun things. So I could fake my RID. So it's my ID. So I can fake it and say, you know what? I'm not Tim. I'm actually going to be Bob. Now, the weird thing is we're going to have a mix match here where the username says TM, but the ID, the numeric ID, part of the security identifier is actually going to be for Bob. And I can send this over and say, cool, give me access to Bob's secret files, right? Neat. I can then look at some of the information. We can see here, if we look at the username, it says Tim, but if we take the ID and then essentially reverse look that up into a name, we can see it says Bob, right? Weird, right? Very, very weird. Of course, we can do other fun things. I mentioned this before. We can add some very powerful administrative groups, right? Domain admins, schema admins, enterprise admins, and access even more databases on this target system, right? And in this case, the login is as me. I didn't change my ID, my SID, didn't change my username, allows me in. Now what we can do is we can do all sorts of other fun things. Let's change it to a non-existent ID, such as 9999, and user, your mom. Yeah, I love the the 8th grade jokes here. So here's an example. And if we actually look at the target service and look at the security log, we can see your mom is logged in, right? Now, that ID 9999 doesn't exist on the network. Definitely your mom doesn't exist on the network, right? So much harder to track down. Like, where the heck did this thing come from, right? Not tying it back to a compromise of Tim or Bob, because remember, this is a compromise of the password hash of the target service because we cracked it using some other system, right? Pretty neat. Let's talk about the golden ticket now. The golden ticket, remember, this is going to be our ticket granting ticket, right? A ticket granting ticket allows us to request other tickets. When I generate a custom ticket granting ticket, remember here, the ticket granting ticket is encrypted using the password hash of KRB-TGT. So if I can get that password hash, I'll generate my own golden ticket saying, hey, I'm Tim and I'm all the kinds of admins. I send this over to the KDC. It looks at it, says this pack looks good, the one that we modified. It copies and pastes that and now uses this in other tickets. The difference between the silver ticket and the golden ticket is the silver ticket works for the one service. Golden ticket is going to work for absolutely everything. And the reason for both of these is Kerberos is a stateless protocol. The state, if you will, is essentially stored inside the ticket that I'm not supposed to be able to read and definitely not supposed to be able to modify. How can we create the ticket? One such way is Mimikatz. Every single command and control framework has the same sort of capability. Here, I'm going to give it the password hash of the KRB-TGT account, whereas in a silver ticket, I give it the password hash of my target service. I've got my ticket loaded into memory. And then what happens is Windows starts to use that. It's like, hey, do I have a ticket granting ticket? Oh, I do. Let me just use this. And again, plenty of different frameworks are going to use this similar sort of attack as well. Another fun attack is the skeleton key. With the skeleton key, if an attacker has compromised the domain controller, what happens is we shim the authentication module so that when the user sends in the encrypted timestamp, it attempts to decrypt using the password hash of the user, as well as the password hash of the word Mimikatz. What this allows us to do then is authenticate as any user as Mimikatz. To do this, one such tool is going to be Mimikatz. Once again, run the skeleton key. Now, the important thing here is this is persistent. The scary thing from an attacker's perspective is this allows me, the pen tester, me, the red teamer in, but frankly, anybody else using this password as well. So we want to be very careful. It is memory resident and memory resident only. So make sure you reboot the domain controller afterwards to get this out of memory and protect the target system. We've got pass the ticket. Well, that's pretty straightforward. Essentially, I'm stealing somebody else's magic band and passing it off as my own. So I can take this, save the ticket to disk, copy it over to another system, and then start using this. Another Kerberos attack is what's called overpass the hash. So what I'm going to do, if I've got the password hash for the target, if I've got the password hash for a user, what I'm going to do is use that password hash to request a valid ticket granting ticket. Now, this ticket granting ticket isn't going to be special. It's not going to allow me super user access to anything beyond what the user already has access to. But it does give me a legitimate ticket. I am following the normal authentication process here. Request a ticket granting ticket, and then I'm going to use that ticket, right? So get the ticket granting ticket, use that ticket granting ticket to access some of the other systems as that other user. Now, when can we use each of these attacks? The golden ticket, very useful for persistence. Very useful for red teams to some degree. Attackers love this because it's a very good persistence mechanism. It's kind of a pain to kick the bad guys out. So we use this. It does require the full domain compromise. So you're not going to start off with this. This is, I've conquered the entire kingdom. Now I've got persistence. Kerberoasting, we use this as a privilege escalation. So I started off as a regular user Tim. Now I can get passwords for service accounts that might be sensitive, or I can get elevated access to those target services. Okay. The elevated access there specifically is related to the silver ticket attack. And frankly, it's also a persistence mechanism as well. And for pass the ticket and overpass the hash, both of those are going to be used for pivoting. I have access to one system, one user. I'm going to use this to access another. All right, so my recommended reading. We went through this kind of a whirlwind fashion. I've got a much longer version if you want to check that out. redstage.com/Kerb101. There's some great posts from the SpecterOps folks. The Rubius tool here is fantastic. And quite frankly, anything by Sean Metcalf. He's got a very detailed blog post on what does authentication with Kerberos look like, what actually happens with that authentication, and so forth. Phenomenal material. Check that out. And with that, I'm going to wrap up. Feel free to contact us. Obligatory salesy slide, I guess, that I forgot to remove. But that's going to wrap things up. So we're going to jump into the question portion. So thank you for attending, and we will jump into the question portion.